Today is September 3rd. It's the 247th day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. Born on this day in 1856, architect Louis Sullivan, the father of the modern skyscraper. Sullivan is born in Boston, Massachusetts. He's a quick study. He finishes high school early and enrolls in MIT when he's 16. After a year there, he leaves to work with architect Frank Furness in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's only there about a year before he's let go. The Depression of 1873 has put a damper on any new business, and Furness can't afford to keep Sullivan on staff. So Sullivan makes his way to Chicago, where there's a building boom taking place in the wake of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 that spreads devastation across more than 3 square miles of the city. He works with architect William LeBaron Jenney for a year. Jenney is experimenting with steel frame buildings. Then Sullivan heads to Paris to study at l'École des Beaux-Arts. Like with his past moves, he's only there for 1 year before moving on again. But this time he returns to Chicago and stays put, working for a few different architects before partnering up with architect Dankmar Adler in 1880. Adler and Sullivan specialize in residences and small commercial buildings at first, and then the Auditorium building on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, completed in 1889. It's an opera house, a hotel, some office space, 10 stories high with heavy load-bearing walls. One of Sullivan's apprentices on the project is a young Frank Lloyd Wright, who designs some of the interior features of the Auditorium building. In the mid to late 1800s, cities are expanding. Land is becoming more valuable and expensive, and the mass production of steel is in full swing. The firm of Adler and Sullivan soon become known primarily for high-rise office buildings, one of the first of which is the Wainwright Building in St. Louis, Missouri, built in 1890 and 1891. The red brick building designed for brewer Ellis Wainwright is one of the first skyscrapers in the world, all 10 stories of it. And in 1894, the Chicago Stock Exchange building at the corner of Washington and LaSalle, one of many Sullivan buildings lost to the wrecking ball in the mid-20th century. To succinctly encapsulate his approach to modern design, Louis Sullivan coins the phrase, "Form follows function." He writes in the April 1896 issue of Lippincott's magazine, an article entitled "The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered," quote, "Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function. And this is the law. Where function does not change, form does not change. The granite rocks, the ever-brooding hills, remain for ages. The lightning lives, comes into shape, and dies in a twinkling. Louis Sullivan is one of the pioneering architects who design a new form of building, the steel frame skyscraper. Not based on the way buildings have always been designed, with wide load-bearing outer walls, but with a lighter, more durable steel frame, holding the building up from the inside, designing a building for how it's going to be used, rather than how older buildings have traditionally been built. Form follows function, rather than form following precedent. The Adler and Sullivan design for the Prudential Building, now called the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, New York, is a perfect example of Sullivan's form follows function principle. The building is designed in zones. The ground floor is designed for public access to the lobby and shops. The next zone contains office space, floors of identical offices wrapped around the elevator shafts. And the last zone on top of the building contains a smaller warren of offices and more utilities. These days, the layout seems pretty, well, duh. But in 1896, when the Guarantee Building is completed, it's a revolutionary design. Sullivan isn't so terribly strict about his philosophy. Though it serves no real function, the terracotta exterior of the building is heavily ornamented, with ornate patterns of lines that reflect the structure within, the steel skeleton, the different zones, the bottom, middle, and top, beginning, middle, and end, the story of the structure as an intricate design of leaves and vines wrapped around the structure itself. Its ornamentation similar to that which Sullivan designs for the interior of the Transportation Building in the World's Columbian Exposition held in Chicago 3 years earlier in 1893. The Guarantee Building is the last building designed by Adler and Sullivan. In the early 1900s, Louis Sullivan, the father of the skyscraper, born on this day in 1856, sees his career decline, relegated to designing a series of small Midwestern banks, Sullivan's jewel boxes as they're referred to. He passes away in 1924 at the age of 67. Also born on this day in 1875, Ferdinand Porsche, automotive engineer, designer of the Volkswagen Beetle and the Mercedes SSK, and founder of the high-performance sports car manufacturer Porsche. Porsche is born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He is mechanically adept as a young man, but he has no formal training as an engineer. But that doesn't stop an 18-year-old Porsche from landing a job at Lohnerwerk, a company that specializes in building luxury coaches. After a few years at the company, Porsche designs a prototype electric car, the Lohner Porsche Mixed Hybrid. In the early 1900s, the Lohner Porsche proves to be too expensive for the masses. So Lohner uses the technology Porsche designs in some of their buses. More than half a century later, Boeing and NASA will use the Lohner Porsche design as the basis for the lunar rover that the Apollo astronauts drive around up on the moon. In 1906, Porsche takes on the role of chief designer for Austro-Daimler, designing cars for Prussian royalty. He works there for more than 20 years. When World War I ends in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceases to exist. So given a choice, Porsche chooses Czech citizenship. In 1926, the company merges with another company, forming Daimler-Benz, and Porsche works up a concept for a small, lightweight Mercedes-Benz. But the powers that be at Daimler-Benz, they're not really interested. He leaves Daimler-Benz and in 1931 forms a consulting group in Stuttgart, Germany, which eventually becomes the company we know today as Porsche. Porsche begins working on his design for a small car, but as the economic depression of the 1930s drags on, he takes on a commission from the German government to motorize the nation. German leader Adolf Hitler hires Porsche to design a people's car, one that any German can afford. Porsche designs the Volkswagen for the Führer, which later becomes known as the Volkswagen Beetle. Hitler loves the car, but he hates Czechs. So the Nazis arrange for Porsche to renounce his Czech citizenship and become a full-fledged German. Problem solved. Porsche and the Nazis are thick as thieves during World War II. Porsche designs a number of tanks and vehicles for the military. After the war, Ferdinand Porsche, his son Ferry Porsche, and son-in-law Anton Piesch are arrested as war criminals. Porsche's son Ferry is released after a few months, but Porsche and Piesch are held for a few years, finally being released in 1947. During their captivity, Porsche's son Ferry has been keeping the business afloat, doing repairs and working up a new design, the Porsche 356, the first car to bear the Porsche brand. In 1948, they build 49 Porsche 356s by hand in an old mill-turned factory in Gmünd, Austria. Needless to say, the Gmund 356s are exceptionally valuable these days. Porsche, the company, moves back to Stuttgart in 1949. They continue producing 356s there, but Ferdinand Porsche's health is failing. At the end of 1950, he's hired on by Volkswagen to consult on the mass production of the VW Beetle. But just a few weeks later, he suffers a stroke. Ferdinand Porsche, born on this day in 1875, passes away in early 1951 at the age of 75. There are 119 days left in the year. On This Day is produced by me, Dave Schultz. Thank you very much for listening. Also born on this day in 1963, author Malcolm Gladwell. Fantastic writer, even more fantastic brain. He's got a podcast now. It's called Revisionist History. It's pretty good. You should have a listen. Hey, and maybe he'll mention my podcast now that I mentioned his. And also born on this day in 1964, Spike Feresten, TV writer, producer, and personality, who I only mention because I love his Instagram feed. If you enjoy vintage Porsches by the truckload and other exotic classic cars, check out Spike on Instagram. So if you're still listening, what do you hear? Talk to you tomorrow.